All right, hey everybody. Today we're talking about front handsprings. Now on the screen it says head spring. That is not a typo. We are going to be talking about front handsprings, but we need to first understand a head spring as it is a key component to learning how to tumble forwards. Now, if you remember at all any of the conversation we've had about limbering, a front head spring is basically a front limber with more energy in the system. And so oftentimes you'll ask somebody to do a front head spring and they will say, okay, and then they do a bunch of funniness instead of thinking about just doing a front limber. So we'll get more into that and you'll understand it. But here we go. Front head spring. So you have the number one image. The hands are on the surface, the head is on the surface, the elbows are in, and the feet are on the ground. Number two image. It is a late block. So the center of mass is trying to travel over the pivot point. So the hips are traveling over the shoulders so that when the hips start to open and drive the heels drive into the surface. Head springs, most errors, people do handstands or headstands instead of driving their feet into the surface. And so then they just do a headstand with a straight shape and fall over. You need the pike action to travel over the pivot point. So when you open the hips as aggressively as possible, it does what number 4 happens is it pulls your hands off the surface. Now here, most people try to stand up and then they pick their head and shoulders up and it's exactly like a front limber. They err. So this is really taking front limber concepts and adding flight to it. That's basically it. Then you have 5, you keep the shoulder angle open. 6, you're in a straight line. So linear momentum. This one's a little bit silly in the picture. But if you look at the blue arrow, it's kind of saying, look at the distance that you're traveling. Okay, so there's 3 key shapes. You're in a headstand position, the first orange star at the top. You shoot open to this bridge-ish position, and then it's supposed to rotate you to your feet. But you're not actually traveling very far if you look at the blue arrow. A lot is happening, but the travel is very small. You know, if you look at this picture, it looks like the person is traveling a very big distance, but they're actually not. Their feet are actually landing maybe, a couple feet away from their hands at most, depending on the size of the person. So they're actually not traveling. So there's not a lot of linear momentum. If anything, the linear momentum is in the hip travel, and the hip travel from number 1 to number 2 is not a lot. So that's about as much linear momentum you're going to have. So this is a huge, massively, painstakingly shape change heavy skill, and it's very, very good to teach, because if you cannot shape change well, if you cannot do a head spring well, then you're going to suffer a shape changing in other components, capacities, and skills. Okay, so linear momentum, if you think about it, you used to be able to probably jump half the body length, so you don't even need to be able to move your center of mass that far to do this, which is what makes head springs great. Most people have enough linear momentum to head spring. The question is, do they have enough flexibility and coordination? Angular momentum, we have the easy side, right? Less linear momentum, lots of shape change, lower impact force. Head springs are more on the easy side than the sense of difficult angular momentum, because it requires more shape change. Difficult requires more linear momentum. Now, this is a giant spectrum. I can't measure how much linear momentum is needed, but in a head spring, the amount of linear momentum that's required is a lot different than what's in a front handspring. So that's the thing to understand. Now, there is still a aggressiveness that needs to happen in moving the hips. There still is linear momentum that must take place. You cannot just slowly move your body and hope it's all going to work out. But again, it's not the same amount of energy that you're going to need to do like a front handspring double front type of linear momentum. So we have our shape changes, just to review, is a straight body shape requires more force and the linear momentum versus this more speed. So head spring has more of the pike action. It requires more speed. So it's more about getting the hips to travel, getting the heels to drive, and being quick in your shape changes. That's what makes things work. It's not so much just cheating it by pushing your hips as hard as you possibly can. There's more in the story. Angular momentum. There's very little linear momentum to convert, like we saw. Where the head and hands are, there's not a lot of travel. So the time you have, okay, to move the hips, the time you have is not a whole lot. And so that means that there's a lot of shape change required, which means when you hit the flight phase, to go from the bridge position through the flight phase to the stand, there's a lot of energy you actually have to be able to store and conserve to get to the stand phase. So that's why shape changing is so important in the head spring, and that's why it's a great skill to be teaching people how to shape change in. Rotational inertia. You're actually growing out of this skill because the head spring starts in a down position. You're actually going from small to big, which requires even more effort, essentially, in the angular momentum side of things. So if you look at the distance of how much the body is actually growing and then how much time you have to grow with the flight image with the blue arrow, it's again, you're running into this problem. I have to grow a lot, but I don't have a lot of time. Usually people don't grow, they close their shoulder angle, throw their head, and they actually shrink their body, and so that's why they can't actually stand up on their feet. So here we have the head spring. We have what we call the tap, the snap. You're now looking at the block, so you kind of learned if you watched the round off video what an early and late block kind of is. But now the tap. The tap is the loading position. You're loading the body, and then the snap is the release of that tension so that it pulls you. So the tap is really from the headstand all the way to the heel drive, and all of that is like pulling a rubber band back, and the snap is as if you were to release the rubber band and it snaps back to position. And so you have this tap and snap. It's a pretty long tap, pretty small area that you're snapping. You have the block. You can see that the orange arrow is pointing at an angle because the hips are traveling past that blocking point, so we're traveling that direction. Now, if we wanted to go more vertical, the hips wouldn't travel over the head as much, and then you would be sending the feet to the ceiling instead of the feet to the surface. The flight phase shows you kind of where the flight phase is. Okay, there is a flight phase. It's very, very small in a head spring. It's almost as if your hands and feet just trade places immediately. There's not a lot of flight going on. Front head springs, progressions. Do them down a wedge. Do them over a panel mat. Put your head and hands on the panel mat. Heel drive over the panel mat into the surface. Do them up a panel mat. Put your head and hands on the panel mat and front handspring and land on top of the panel mat. Variations would be doing front limber out or front walkover out. So you could do a head spring and just finish in a bridge, not actually do the flight phase, but just headstand, shoot open to a bridge, and then do the front limber to finish. You could do the head spring, shoot open to a bridge on one foot, and then try to front walk over out. So you could put variations to slow down because the flight phase is usually where people make the mistake. Get the shape change working. It's basically like a front limber from headstand. Get them comfortable at that before they add the flight phase. Which leads us to the front handspring. So the front handspring needs somebody to be proficient in the shape changes of the front head spring. Let's get into it. So front handspring, now we're on our feet. We're placing our hands close to our feet. There is a piking action. It may not be this extreme, but the idea is that the hips need to go over the hands and the feet need to drive into the surface. Most error in handsprings is the hands are too far out and the feet are driving up to the ceiling instead of into the surface, so you don't get this bend, fast rotation contact point. Number 4 is a flight phase. Again, it's just like a front limber. Keep your shoulder angle open. Eyes are focused on the hands. Linear momentum. How much distance are you traveling? So how much linear momentum do you need to complete the front handspring? That's just the question you have to answer. And does the person generate enough linear momentum? Move in a straight line horizontally. Can you move your center of mass that distance? If you cannot, you're just going to struggle with a front handspring traveling that distance. So you're going to need more shape change and less travel. Again, simple test. Jump from your feet to your hands to see how far you can carry your center of mass. Angular momentum, we've seen this before, but again, just a refresher, we're doing a front handspring. We are not actually trying to stop our body with our hands, so our hands close to our foot is a good thing. Being in a straight line in a front handspring, not really always a good thing, because now you can see right now with the position of this image, the hands are forward, so this is an early block, the foot is going up. So the body's actually, center mass is going to actually rise, and we don't want to rise because we're doing a front handspring. If this was vault, this might not actually be that bad of a position in the sense of relationship to hands and center of mass, because we do want to rise on a vault, but we don't want to rise on floor. We're trying to travel horizontally. So again, knowing where do I put my hands and then what shape do I need to be in to make it work. So tapping into the angular momentum concepts again. If I'm in a straight line, the surface is pushing against my hand. So the green arrow at the bottom facing left, the surface is pushing against my hand. So my hands are pushing against that arrow. So that's going to cause me to rotate or pivot over my hands. The top arrow by the foot is pointing to the right. That means that my foot is driving over my hands or against the arrow that's pushing me the other way. And that's what causes the rotation. If you hold something, you push it to the ends, two opposite directions, you're going to create rotation. This is how the rotation works. The problem with this type of rotation is it's not necessarily going to rotate you into the surface. It might actually pop you up in the air, and that's not what you necessarily want early on. The second image has a green arrow pointing to the ceiling or up from the hands and a down arrow pushing down on the foot. This is going to get us to rotate into the surface. So the surface is pushing up on the hands and the foot is driving into the surface. So that means that as the foot drives down, the hands are going to get pulled off the surface. They can't go through the floor. So that's going to create rotation into the surface. And it is more important to learn how to rotate into a surface, okay, because that is how you generate power and continue carrying the energy, is by staying on the surface and keeping the energy in contact with that push against the equal and opposite actions, right? Create a reaction. So you're trying to push against things so that they continue pushing you. So if you're not pushing against anything, then you're not being pushed. And that's the main thing. If you're in the air, you cannot push yourself anymore. So learning how to stay on the surface to keep pushing yourself. Head spring up a panel mat. So test your angular momentum. Can you do a head spring up a panel mat? If you can do this, you probably have enough angular momentum for a front handspring. Angular momentum, again, just drilling this into your brains, because front handsprings, a person can be successful at them, but the question is not can you front handspring. The question is, can you front handspring to do a front handspring double front, or a front handspring layout, or a front handspring something else. You're trying to use the front handspring to do more. Angular momentum is rotating around your center of mass by shape changing on a surface. The more linear momentum and the more shape change on the surface, the more angular momentum generated. So that really would apply probably to vault, because you don't usually see people do front handspring double front layouts. It's pretty rare stuff there. But you can see with the straight line on the more force, you're a longer diameter, I guess you could say, for the circle. So it's just going to require more, versus the shorter, smaller diameter of the circle is going to rotate better. It's going to grow into a larger diameter because you're kicking your leg, but it passes through and it shrinks just as back down. It's just as fast. So yes, you're getting longer, but you're actually getting smaller again. And there's more physics to that whole story. But again, just showing you another example of what works. Angular momentum. So very little linear momentum to convert. So if you're putting your hands close to your feet, you're closing your shoulder angle, which is not a bad thing. And then if you look at the second image with over the clock, you'll see that the hips are now piking. So it's going from shoulder pike to hip pike. Then the hips are traveling over the shoulders and hands. And now when the foot drives open, it's driving into the surface, causing flight. And then that flight continues to rotate onto your feet. I'm showing you this because we call this kind of like a ravel or an unravel. So the body's unraveling into this arch position. And unraveling, learning how to generate angular momentum from unraveling, is a very efficient and effective way to learn how to rotate. So green arrows are just giving you ideas of what's pushing where. On the first image, you have the hips pushing over the shoulders. So the shoulders are closed, but in the next image, they're going to be opening. So that tells you why the green arrow is pointing that way, versus the hips are traveling over. So you can see now there's this rotational relationship. You have a green arrow that says, right above a lot of shape change required. Green arrow pushing up on the hands. The shoulders are pushing open. The shoulders are pushing away, and then the foot is pushing down. It's kind of creating a circle in the sense of the arrows. Then as you follow the arrow, pushing the shoulders open into the end position, you have an arrow pushing the shoulders open while the feet are driving backwards. And so it's finishing the circle. Here's some interesting stuff with your rotational inertia. So you have a height, but you're going to shrink that shape down. So you have distance of where the foot needs to travel. You have distance of where the hands are going to be traveling and where the shape's going to shrink, but then it's going to grow. Big question is, how much shape change do I need for how much time I have in the air, which is not a lot. So I'm going to have to travel more distance than I have time. So front handspring, here's your tap phase, and then there's your snap phase. And you can see the block. You're trying to travel over the pivot point. You're trying to send everything into the surface so it rotates and while carrying the linear momentum. And then the snap phase happens at the end. And the snap phase is generally where you would initiate the front tuck or a front layout or something like that. You'd be transitioning from tap snap back into another tap snap. So it kind of follows itself when you start connecting. Flight phase, just looking at the idea that, okay, the feet are going to almost hit the floor and then your hands come up, and then how much rotation actually has to happen. If I want to connect a front handspring, I got to get my feet underneath me. So going from the first image with the blue arrow, it's like your feet are got to be really close to the surface, but then you have to rotate a lot before they touch the ground. And those two things is what makes front handsprings or any sort of tumbling actually difficult, is how do I stay as close to the surface as possible, but maximize the rotation before I hit the surface. So connections are all about late blocks. So the first one with the arrow sign is basically saying your foot is on the ground in front of your center of mass. So your pivot point is in front, and that's going to send you up. And up is not going to help you connect or multiple front handsprings. So the second and third are better. Now the second one's a little tricky because the foot that's in front, your body has to travel over that foot. So when it goes on the ground, you need to have your center of mass in front of it. And that's what makes step outs more tricky. The third one is more like if you're to do a fly spring or bounder out of the front handspring, the center of mass is over your pivot point. Arrows just letting you know where your body's traveling. So on the arrow sign, you can see that the chest is traveling up and the foot is getting pushed backwards. This is going to pop the body up. Versus if you look at the last one, the arrow is pushing the feet up and the chest is traveling forwards. This is going to rotate you down. Okay, relationship of center of mass to your pivot point, just so you can see what's going on and why that's important. So trampoline, this is something to prerequisite on getting the heel drive, the hip action open. So you do a backdrop, you're in a pike position, trampoline is going down. The heels need to drive down into the surface. As the trampoline starts to go up, you leave the feet on the surface and you go to a stand position. Okay, this is transitioning from your one side of your body to the other side of your body, staying on the surface and seeing how the energy carries you. It's an excellent drill on understanding how to use your hips to open your body up and use that heel drive to transition from one side to the other and then feel the effects of it without a whole lot going on. Another one would be a dog drop to front handspring. And so you do a dog drop to a piked handstand. You want the hips to travel over the shoulders and the hands, and then you drive everything into the surface, causing you to rotate. So it's a dog drop front handsprings. Your hand actually stay on the surface for a very long time on a trampoline. But in the piked handstand position, as you're driving the feet down, the hands are getting pushed up. This is just a supplementary skill. So basically this is a more complicated version of this. This is simplifying it. You go dog drop to back drop, then you rotate to seat drop, and then you go to your feet. This is just getting a person comfortable with the rotational side. Now you could go dog drop, back drop, and then drive your feet into the surface just like this one and finish in the stand position. So you could connect this to this one and cut out the seat drop and just transition. Right? So you have your dog drop, seat, feet. So this is forwards rotation, just understanding how do you want to rotate. I go for my dog, I go for my seat, I go to my feet. The arm staying up in the air is a transition point to say, hey, I'm pushing off my hands now need to go to high. You're landing in a seat drop position. I am aware that you are not supporting your spine, but hey, you're not supporting your spine when you're doing a front handspring and you're rebounding on the surface either. So you better get really good at this, and it's better to get good at this on a soft surface than doing it on a hard surface and doing it wrong. Okay, what you want to use it for is you go dog drop to seat drop, but then you say just kidding. And instead of landing in the seat drop position, you open up the hips, causing you to arch before landing into a bridge. And now you're doing dog drop to front handspring. So this is getting those pieces put together to get a front handspring on a trampoline and learn how to shape change appropriately. Front handsprings. Okay, it's basically pike front limber, shoot to bridge. Fast front walkovers. Do it over a panel mat, do it off a panel mat. The main thing is to know that front handspring is a late block. Your hands do not want to stop you from traveling forwards or rotating you, and neither do your feet. So it's figuring out how to keep engaged in that, which requires a lot of shape change. So that's the front handspring. You are going to be working on a front handspring for quite a while, so don't be in a rush to just move on. Master the front handspring. Take the time to pay attention to the details, teach the concepts, focus on a concept, whether it's just having good shape change or it's having good tension in the body or starts and finishes, but don't be in a rush to try to go double front handsprings. Get a good solid base foundation of understanding how front handsprings work, and then worry about all the other stuff. All right, there you go. Keep the conversation going. Talk to other coaches, talk to whoever, and keep the conversation going so that you keep learning.